Have you ever felt the pressure to give the tithe for fear of stealing from God? Have you been told that, if you do not contribute, the gates of heaven might close to you? But what if I told you that the church has never told you the whole truth about the tithe? The reality is that many believers live under the weight of guilt and fear, giving their money not out of devotion, but out of obligation. Worse yet, they believe that if they do not pay, they will face divine punishment. But today you are going to discover 3 biblical secrets about the tithe that can completely change your perspective on this practice. What you are about to hear may be shocking, but it can also free your faith once and for all. If you have ever wondered whether you are being manipulated or whether you truly have a duty before God, stay until the end, because what I am going to reveal to you could transform your spiritual life forever. In the Old Testament, the tithe was not simply a financial transaction or a sacred tribute destined for the church. In reality, it played a fundamental role within Israelite society. When we examine the scriptures, we see that the tithe was not limited to a fixed amount, nor was it a mere religious obligation. It was a provision system designed to sustain the Levites, the most needy, and to finance the festivities that strengthened the faith and unity of the people. Understanding this foundation is key to discerning how God really wants us to manage our resources and practice generosity. For example, the Levites were the only tribe that did not receive land as an inheritance, according to Numbers 18:24. Their mission was to devote themselves to the temple, to spiritual affairs, and to intercede for the people before God. But without land to cultivate or animals to raise, how could they subsist? The tithe was established as a mechanism for their sustenance, ensuring that those who served God full-time were neither forgotten nor neglected. This leaves us with a key lesson. God never abandons those who dedicate themselves to His work, but the question is, should this practice remain exactly the same today? An interesting detail is that there was not a single type of tithe. In Deuteronomy 14 verses 28 to 29, we find the so-called triennial tithe, which was stored to help orphans, widows, and foreigners. This reveals to us a powerful aspect of God's heart. He cares about the most vulnerable. The tithe was not only about sustaining spiritual leaders, but it also functioned as a system of social justice, a means to ensure that no one was left destitute. Imagine a society where everyone contributes and no one goes without because there is a collective commitment to everyone's well-being. This was the divine intention. In addition to sustaining the Levites and helping the needy, the tithe also had a third purpose: celebration and worship. Deuteronomy 14 verses 22 to 27 shows us that part of the tithe was used for religious festivals, times of gratitude, and praise to God. The people gathered to eat and celebrate before the Lord, acknowledging that all provision came from Him. This refutes the idea that the tithe was an imposed burden, when in reality it was deeply linked with joy, communion, and gratitude. God never designed His laws to be a burden, but rather as a means to teach His people to depend on Him with faith and trust. But notice the contrast with how the tithe is presented in some places today. In many cases, it has become a demand under threats of curses. However, the Bible shows us that the true purpose of the tithe was much deeper and more meaningful. It was not a sacred tax, but an expression of love, justice, and communal provision. So, the big question is, are we practicing the true spirit of the tithe, or are we merely following a system that may have strayed from God's original intention? Furthermore, the tithe in the Old Testament was not limited to money. It included crops, livestock, and other goods produced by the land. In other words, God asked the people to set aside a portion of what He Himself had provided. The principle here was not the exact monetary value, but faithfulness in acknowledging that everything belongs to the Lord. This leads us to reflect. Nowadays, is the focus on the financial value or on the disposition of the heart? Many believe that the tithe was an obligation for all the people of Israel, but there is an interesting detail. It only applied to those who had agricultural produce or flocks. In other words, if someone had neither crops nor animals, they were not obliged to give the tithe. This point reveals a key principle. God never demands from someone more than they can give. Faithfulness and gratitude must spring from the heart, not be an imposed burden on those who already face hardship. In light of all this, it becomes clear that the tithe in the Old Testament was a system of mutual care, not an instrument of manipulation. Its purpose was to express God's justice, ensuring that the temple servants were sustained, the needy received help, and the fellowship of the people was strengthened. But if the tithe was so important in that era, what happened to it in the New Testament? Did Jesus uphold this model or introduce a new perspective on generosity and offerings? To understand this, we must examine Christ's teachings and how he redefined the concept of giving. Now we move on to the second point, where we will see how Jesus transformed the meaning of the tithe and taught us to perceive generosity in a deeper, more transformative way. After all, for Christ, the true offering goes far beyond the monetary value given. Let us explore this powerful lesson and learn how to apply this principle in our life of faith. Jesus shifted the focus of the tithe. More important than the amount is the intention of the heart. Many believe that faithfulness to God is measured by the sum of money donated to the church, but is that what Jesus taught? In Matthew 23 verse 23 we find a shocking moment in which Christ confronts the Pharisees, saying to them, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." This verse reveals something powerful. Jesus does not condemn the tithe itself, but the mechanical and empty way it was practiced. The problem did not lie in the offering, but in the absence of a truly transformed heart. The Pharisees were known for their impeccable religiosity. They were meticulous to the extreme, even separating the smallest herbs from their gardens in order to tithe. However, while they fulfilled this rule to the letter, they ignored deeper principles, such as compassion for the poor, justice in human relationships, and genuine faith in God. Their mistake was becoming obsessed with the ritual instead of the essence of faith. What Jesus teaches us here is that God is not interested only in the numbers, but in the heart of the giver. Any offering that does not spring from a heart full of love and gratitude loses its spiritual value. This lesson becomes even clearer in the story of the widow who offered her last coin in the temple, according to Mark 12 verses 41 to 44. While the rich were placing large sums into the offering box, Jesus drew his disciples' attention to a poor woman who gave only 2 small copper coins. In human eyes, her amount was insignificant, but Jesus declared that that widow had given more than all the others. Why? On this occasion, we can see that the woman did not give only what she had left over, but what she truly needed, with a heart completely devoted to God. This passage challenges the mindset that God is impressed by large material amounts, when what really matters is the genuine motivation behind the act of giving. Jesus, through his teachings, revolutionized the way we should view the act of offering something to God. In the Old Testament, the tithe was considered an obligation, a legal requirement. However, with the arrival of Christ, a new perspective was presented: voluntary generosity, based on love and faith in Christ. The true offering, therefore, is not the one we make out of fear of punishment or mere religious tradition, but the one that springs from a heart genuinely transformed by divine grace. This message invites us to reflect deeply. When we give, are we simply fulfilling a rule, or are we truly expressing a heart that has been touched and transformed by God? Moreover, Jesus did not speak only of financial offerings. He taught about an even greater and deeper surrender. Throughout his life on earth, he revealed to us that the greatest calling of a follower of God is to give oneself completely, to love one's neighbor, to help the needy, to forgive those who offend us, and to serve others. All of these are acts of offering that go beyond money, for they involve something far more valuable: our time, our attention, and our love. Are we really willing to give some of our time and love to those who need a word of hope? The generosity that Christ teaches us is not limited to offerings made in the temple. He invites us to be generous in all aspects of life: in forgiveness, in hospitality, in patience, and in caring for others. Sometimes the most valuable offering we can give is not found in our bank account, but in the time we devote to someone who needs support or a simple gesture of affection. When we understand that generosity goes beyond finances, we realize that monetary donation is only a small part of what it means to be generous in God's kingdom. It is interesting to note that Jesus never demanded a fixed tithe from his disciples. He spoke about giving, helping, and serving, but he never imposed an exact amount. This is because, for him, the focus was on the disposition of the heart, not on a strict rule. In God's kingdom, generosity is not seen as a system of collection, but as a reflection of God's love in our lives. When we are filled with that love, the act of giving becomes a privilege, not an obligation. This message can be liberating for many people who live anguished, believing that they must deliver an exact amount to please God. The reality is that Jesus never conditioned divine blessings on financial value. For him, faith and obedience were the true paths to living an abundant life. Those who give with a pure heart will never be abandoned by God, because he promises to provide for every need. But if the tithe is not a requirement in the New Testament, how should we understand offerings? There are, in fact, new ways to contribute, taught by Jesus and the apostles. In the next topic, we will explore how the New Testament establishes a model of contribution that is not based on fear or obligation, but on joy and freedom. By looking at the early church and the teachings of the apostles, we see that the concept of contribution changed considerably compared to the Old Testament. The legalistic model of mandatory tithing gave way to a far more powerful and transformative principle, the voluntary offering. The voluntary offering, motivated by love and gratitude, is a fundamental principle in Christianity. The Apostle Paul, when writing to the Corinthians, made it clear that each one must give what he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. 2 Corinthians 9 verse 7. This verse perfectly summarizes the new Christian perspective on offerings. It is not about a fixed percentage, but about an expression of spontaneous generosity, free from pressure or manipulation. True generosity arises from the genuine desire to give, and this idea of freedom in contribution is repeated throughout the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2, Paul instructs the church to set aside their offerings in keeping with each one's income. This means that God does not impose an exact amount on anyone. Those who have more can give more, those who have less can give less, and those who have nothing should not feel guilty. The logic behind this principle is clear. The offering should not be seen as a rigid obligation, but as an act of love proportional to each person's means. It is an act of generosity that springs from a willing heart and a sincere spirit. This principle of spontaneous, pressure-free generosity is what characterized the early church. In Acts 2 verse 44-45, we see a radically different model from what we often see today. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold their possessions and goods and distributed the proceeds to anyone who had need. This model was based on brotherly love, where no one suffered lack, because there was a genuine commitment to help one another. There was no pressure, only a sincere desire to share what they had. Unfortunately, today many distort this message of generosity, turning it into a bargaining chip with God. Some sermons teach that giving large offerings is the path to material blessings, but this is not the true motivation the Bible teaches. Generosity should not be driven by the expectation of getting something in return, but by the awareness that everything we have comes from God's hands. This point is crucial, as it reminds us that we are not owners of what we possess, but merely stewards of the resources God has given us. Moreover, it is important to note that offerings in the New Testament were not used only to support the institutional church, but also to help those in need. Paul, for example, organized collections to help Christians who were undergoing difficulties, Romans 15 verse 25-27. This reinforces the original purpose of Christian contribution, not to enrich religious leaders, but to bless the lives of others. When we offer something, we should always ask ourselves, is this offering fulfilling God's purpose, or is it simply sustaining a human system? Freedom in offering also teaches us the importance of a sincere heart. In Acts 5, we find the story of Ananias and Sapphira, a married couple who sold a piece of property and pretended to donate the full price to the church, but in reality kept back part of the proceeds. The problem was not that they kept part of the money, but the lie and the intention to deceive, trying to appear as something they were not. This act reveals how true generosity must be aligned with honesty and sincerity of heart. An offering that does not spring from a pure and sincere heart loses its value before God, who looks beyond the physical act and knows the deepest intentions. This model of generosity, where the act of giving is a reflection of genuine love and not a transaction to receive something in return, challenges us to live our faith in a way that honors God in all our actions. 04 Mini High.